With his gray beard and spectacles, Dr. Harold Shipman was an unassuming man living in the small suburban English town of Hyde, just east of Manchester. No one could have guessed he would go on to be known as Dr. Death after his insidious methodology of murder. He was convicted of murdering 15 of his patients, but authorities estimate it's more likely he killed between 215 to 260 people between 1971 and 1998, making him Britain's most prolific mass murderer. To this day, the motive for his crimes is unknown, and Shipman's twisted psychological landscape continues to puzzle investigators. Harold Frederick Shipman was born January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. He came from a modest working-class family and was affectionately nicknamed Fred. He was said to be a very bright child, but also was described by some as a loner. A personal tragedy early in his life may have inspired his decision to go into medicine. As a teenager, he watched his mother die of lung cancer, observing helplessly as she was given injections of diamorphine to ease the pain of her disease, the very drug he later used to murder his own patients. She passed away when he was 17, and her loss, as well as her suffering itself, were said to have profoundly affected him. In 1965, Shipman began his studies at Leeds University Medical School and began dating Primrose May Oxtoby. Primrose became pregnant with their first child not long after they met, and they married on November 5, 1966. They had 4 children together and were seemingly an average, happy family. Shipman graduated from medical school in 1970 and began working as a junior doctor in West Yorkshire. In 1974, he secured his first general practitioner position at another medical center in the same town. Not long after he started there, his true colors began to show. Shipman had a heroin problem, or more broadly, a problem with injectable painkillers. In 1975, Shipman was caught forging prescription narcotics for his own use, and by February 1976, he had been convicted of obtaining opioids through forgery and deception. As a result, Shipman lost his job, was fined £600, and briefly checked into a drug rehabilitation clinic. However, Shipman was never officially penalized by the General Medical Council, or GMC, the official body that regulates medical practitioners in the UK. Rather, they only wrote him a warning letter. Because of this, his later employers were likely never told about his prior conviction or any of his other issues. By 1977, Shipman was successfully practicing again as a GP at a medical center in Hyde, the town where the majority of his murders would take place. That is not to say Dr. Death had not yet begun indulging in his other vice. As early as March 1975, around the time he was caught abusing painkillers, experts believe he killed his first alleged victim while on the job. Her name was Ava Lyons, and she was killed the night before her 71st birthday. In 1985, the police looked into the suspicious death and possible murder of one of his patients, but nothing ever came of it. By the 1980s, Shipman had become a respected doctor and member of the Hyde community, and in 1992, Shipman had established his own private practice in family medicine. The independence and lack of oversight afforded him more opportunity to commit his crimes, though by this point, he had already killed over 70 people. At the time he was caught, he had over 3,000 registered patients, and his reputation with them was so solid, many were unable to believe he was a murderer. However, not everyone was as quick to absolve him. Others pointed out that he had few close friends and described him as aggressive, conceited, and arrogant. Reportedly, he could be hateful to any person he considered his intellectual inferior. Shipman would make house calls, and in the majority of cases, killed patients using a lethal injection of diamorphine, the pharmaceutical name of heroin, in their own homes. The nature of the murder meant Shipman watched them die relatively quickly. Hiding in plain sight, Shipman was known to prey mostly upon his elderly patients. His victims were frequently older women who lived alone but were in good health, and who had only seen him for a checkup or to inquire about a mild affliction. Of his victims, 171 were women and 44 were men. He was also known to target people with terminal illnesses and chronic conditions, but would also kill patients he merely considered annoying. Dame Janet Smith, a high court judge who served as the Shipman Inquiry chairperson, said of his ability to ensnare his victims. Many patients described Shipman as having a wonderful bedside manner, especially with the elderly. He would make much of them and sometimes tease them gently. They liked it. He made them feel that he was a real friend as well as their doctor. Yet, he would kill them. Shipman was also known for being blunt or straightforward with his patients, in a manner that some found reassuring. For example, on February 28, 1998, Stephen Dixon called Shipman to ask about his father-in-law, Harold Edelston's cancer prognosis. Dixon later reported that Shipman said of the patient's life expectancy, "I wouldn't buy him any Easter eggs." 4 days later, Edelston became one of Shipman's murder victims, which was sudden, but was not questioned given the dire prognosis the doctor had reported. Shipman had several methods by which he managed to hoard massive amounts of diamorphine. Drugs of this nature are generally highly regulated and controlled, but somehow, through failures in the system and Shipman's own ingenuity, he managed to evade detection by his colleagues and the authorities for over 20 years. In some cases, he was able to call in false prescriptions and would also steal drugs from his cancer patients. One investigatory report found that between 1992 and 1998, Shipman had managed to illegally obtain over 24,000 milligrams of diamorphine, an amount capable of killing at least 720 people. After the patient was killed, Shipman usually would persuade their grieving family that an autopsy was not necessary, giving them a passable explanation for the unexpected death. Dame Janet described that Shipman had become a plausible and accomplished liar, a true testament to his skill because the excuses her investigation uncovered were ridiculous. She explained, "Some of his descriptions of sudden death are breathtaking. I turned round to get my stethoscope out of my bag and she just collapsed and died. I was telephoning for an ambulance and she gave one cough. When I turned around, I could see that she had died. She just died while I was examining her." Shipman seemed to have a variety of rhetorical tactics he used to gaslight his patients and their families into respecting his authority. For example, after he murdered Mary Coots in April 1997, he explained icily to her son and daughter-in-law, "Well, I don't believe in keeping them going." In almost all of the cases, Shipman signed the victim's death certificate with their cause of death, which was then followed by the victim's cremation, an end also likely to have been by the doctor's design. Any evidence turned to inscrutable ash. Unbelievably, 2 other doctors were meant to confirm the cause of death and check all documentation before cremation occurred, meaning the murder slipped through a lot of hands along the way. There would be periods of time where the killings would temporarily cease, generally when he became afraid of finally being caught. Usually, when he began murdering his patients again, he would start with someone who was terminally ill. In 1997, he was on his biggest killing spree to date. He had committed 37 murders that year alone, and there was no sign of slowing. From her investigation, Dame Janet hypothesizes, it may be, during these later years, that Shipman was virtually out of control. It is typical of addictive behavior that the subject needs more and more opportunities to feed the addiction. By 1998, suspicions began to arise about the high mortality rate amongst his patients. A nearby medical practice noticed the amount of deaths occurring under Shipman's care was 10 times greater than their office. They reported their concern to the local coroner, who got the Greater Manchester Police involved. However, at the time, investigators failed to do even the most basic of background checks. They didn't look up Shipman's criminal record or check with the medical board for his history. They asked a local health authority to check patient records for irregularities. But the medical advisor couldn't know the doctor regularly added false ailments to his patients' charts to match his story. Subsequently, nothing came from the investigation, and Shipman had 3 more months of freedom to carry out at least 3 more murders before he was finally caught. While Shipman was never motivated by wealth, ironically, it was a sloppy moment of greed that ended up getting him caught. On June 24, 1998, Shipman arrived at the quaint cottage belonging to Kathleen Grundy, a former mayor of Hyde. The 81-year-old woman was fit and in excellent health and was expecting a routine blood test when she was instead given a lethal injection of narcotic painkillers. On her death certificate, he certified her cause of death to be old age and checked off the box that she should be cremated. However, he lied about one more official document, one he could not so easily explain. Shipman had forged Grundy's will to say she had left him her entire estate, nearly £400,000, which was, of course, a startling revelation to her next of kin. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, who happened to be a lawyer, immediately suspected foul play. She began to look into Shipman's history, at which point his lies became very clear. Shipman was a master of murder, but he was a novice at forgery. He not only left a fingerprint on the fake will, he had also used his personal typewriter, which was missing a letter key that made tracing it back to him incredibly easy. Woodruff made sure her mother was buried rather than cremated, and by August 1, 1998, Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed for testing and evidence of the medical-grade heroin was found in her muscle tissue. Shipman was arrested in relation to her murder on September 7, 1998. Over the next 2 months, 11 more of his victims who had been buried rather than cremated had their bodies exhumed, all revealing the same damning conclusion. They had all been murdered. Authorities got access to the computer and files at Shipman's medical office and found ample evidence of the false entries he made to support the cause of death he claimed on their death certificates. In 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted of forging Kathleen Grundy's will, as well as for committing 15 murders that had taken place between 1995 and 1998, in which the patients had all died by lethal injection of diamorphine. Obviously, these deaths were a tiny fraction of his actual kill count. In the 2-year investigation that followed, some estimate that number is as high as 260 murdered individuals. Shipman was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without opportunity for parole. At his trial, Justice Thane Form said of the crimes, "I have little doubt that each of your victims smiled and thanked you as she submitted to your deadly administrations," voicing the shock and horror many people in England felt as obsessive media coverage created a storm over the audaciously simple murders that had been committed with perpetuity for decades. Shipman never admitted his guilt, nor did he provide any evidence of his motive, leaving experts and investigators to theorize about his senseless killing. Despite her 6-volume report, each containing hundreds of pages of evidence, expert testimony, and analysis, Dame Janet said of the case, "I regret to say that I can shed very little light on why Shipman killed his patients. There is some evidence that he is an addictive personality, and it is possible that killing was a form of addiction." Others have speculated that Shipman got off on playing God or derived pleasure in watching patients die. The way in which Shipman was finally apprehended was so sloppy, especially after decades of being so precise and careful. Authorities set forth a hypothesis that he wanted to get caught by the time he killed his last victim. Psychiatric experts say this is not uncommon in serial killers. Often, they reach a point where the burden of the crimes is too much to bear. And as a means of lessening the pressure or guilt, they may consciously or subconsciously attempt to sabotage themselves. Dame Janet agrees with this theory. She posits that by the spring of 1998, Shipman was on the edge of a breakdown for fear that he would be caught. He knew that investigators were looking into him already. When the sloppy investigation failed to yield results, Shipman got off easy, and he may have wanted to go underground for his own safety. But because he was addicted to killing, he couldn't stay away for long. Dame Janet believes that at this point, Shipman had lost touch with reality and concocted the plan to steal Grundy's fortune as an escape route from his murderous lifestyle. With her money, he could stop being a doctor entirely and run away. On January 13, 2004, just one day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman died by suicide in his cell at Wakefield Prison. A spokeswoman for the prison service said that Shipman had not been threatened by anyone, nor was he considered a risk to himself. Though at other points in his sentence at other prisons, he had occasionally been put on suicide watch. Shipman's death was an unsatisfactory outcome for many of the families of his victims who had wished him to suffer for a long time, and who will always lack the closure of having any explanation for their loved one's murder. The entire medical community also suffered a blow from Shipman's actions, from which it has never fully recovered. In the palliative care community, which specializes in helping terminal patients be more comfortable, the concept of assisted suicide was dicey to start. However, many feel it is a humane way to end the suffering of those whose quality of life is unbearable due to their illness. Some became even more skeptical of those ethics in the wake of Shipman's crimes, affecting the possible legality of the practice throughout the UK, despite the fact that the two issues have virtually nothing in common. In this way, Dr. Death's murderous ways have continued to terrorize the sick and vulnerable people he swore an oath to protect when he was first given his white coat, which was quickly stained with the blood of hundreds of innocent lives.